I don't know about you, but I like a good mystery movie. I watched Knives Out a few weeks ago, and it was good. Maybe not quite to the hype that had been brought to my attention about how great a movie was, but it was really good. I enjoyed it. What makes a good mystery movie a good whodunit is that you get information a little bit at a time. You're involved in this, and in Knives Out, it's not just about who killed the man Harlan, but about someone who sent a news report and money to a private detective. So he was doing a researching this, trying to figure out who did it along with the police. And he played just as much of a role in trying to figure that out. And there's twists and there's turns and there's plots. And as soon as you think that you know who did it, you get another piece of information and it just changes and rearranges the way that you think about something. And we're coming to Genesis chapter 17, the story about Abram. And we're coming with that in mind that it's not really a mystery because God's not out there giving twists and plots and changing things along the way. But I realized as I was going through this that God keeps adding information for Abraham and Sarah's sake, not for himself, not because he's trying to form a mystery, but because they need reassurance as they build their faith, that's transforming faith that we keep talking about. And as God discloses more of these things for their sake, they become moved from what is old, Abram and Sarai, to new names, Abraham and Sarah, and it's for their growth. And so we're going to look at Genesis chapter 17. I just want to read verses 1 to the beginning of verse 3. It says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. And Abram fell face down. It's been another 13 years between Genesis 16 and Genesis 17. There were 10 years between Genesis 15 and Genesis 16. So in all, Abram has been waiting over 23 years for the initial promise to be fulfilled. 23 years is a long time, and I've already addressed this idea that God is on the move even when we think nothing is happening. And you can go back to the sermon called Quiet Grace from Genesis 15 and remind yourselves of that. You see, it's in that uncomfortable silence where our faith grows and we have that opportunity to trust God even more, even when we don't think anything is happening. So we've got 13 years, and after all that time, God comes to Abram and he introduces himself for the very first time with the name El Shaddai, meaning God Almighty. God Almighty, and right away I learn and we learn this really important principle, and that is this, that God has the power and the ability to fulfill this covenant. He could have fulfilled that promise any time in those 23 years, but he didn't. He had the power, he had the ability, period. No one could stop him. And here's what we learn. Just because we have power and ability doesn't mean we should use it right away. Jesus was an example of that. He had the power and the ability, but he didn't use that until he went to the cross, really, and he died for our sin. And he gave us salvation when we turn to him in faith. Power needs to be used wisely and with a God-centered purpose. That's what we learn. Abram would have wanted God to use his power a lot earlier in those 23 years. He would have wanted God to use that just like we do, because Abram wanted to be comfortable. It's like, God, you made a promise. It's time, it's time, it's time. Do it now, just so that he could feel more comfortable and know that God fulfilled it. That's what he would have wanted. That's often what we would have wanted, but actually our comfort is not reason enough for God to display his power. Our goal, our purpose isn't enough reason for God to display his power. God has his purposes, his reasons. And that overall purpose is to show that he is faithful and trustworthy even when we struggle with the silence. And he will do what he says no matter what. And we get to trust him for that. So God appears to Abram. And God says this, he says, I am God Almighty. I think Abram would have been reassured with those words, to know that God is an almighty God and that what he said would be accomplished. I think Abram would have found reassurance, just like we do when we have no knowledge that God is always there with us. But he says this to Abram. After he says, I am God Almighty, he says, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. So the question is, how do we walk before God? What does that look like? When I've read this in the past, I kind of look at the be blameless as the adjective to describe how to walk before God, to be blameless. But as I look at it this time, as I did a word study on it, the word be is not a command. It's not in the imperative. It's not a command to be blameless. It is actually the result. It is a consequence of walking before God. So the instruction is to walk before God, and then you will live a blameless life. Actually, I think that makes it even more important to understand how to walk before God. And why? Because the Old Testament was all about the law and trying to live out the law, a list of do's and don'ts, and yet we know that couldn't happen. The Pharisees in Jesus' day gave that list of do's and don'ts and then expanded on it so that people would know how to live. But we know that no one could live blameless according to the rules and according to the law. But I think Micah tells us how to walk before God. In Micah chapter 6, verse 8, it says, He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. When we follow the principles of this verse, we will live blameless lives, to treat people justly. And in our world right now and everything that is happening in our world, and just to say those words, Black Lives Matter. To live without prejudice and to believe in our heart that all people are equal because we all carry the image of God, no matter what we look like, no matter where we come from, no matter what our religion is or our political perspectives, we are all in the image of God. And so we are to act justly, to treat people that way. To be moved by mercy, not by judgment or revenge, or thinking that people who are in pain and struggle somehow are getting what they deserve because of the decisions that they've made. You see, mercy is all about not getting what we deserve. And then to live in humility, knowing that we are not worthy, but that all that we are and all that we have is really God's gift to us. Not that we are good and therefore we get these things, but to walk in humility. Humility is not just the absence of pride. Humility is a heart that revels in who God is rather than who we are. So Abram's reaction to God tells me that his faith has developed over the course, and it truly reflects these words from Micah. There's a contrast, actually, of Abram between Genesis 15 and Genesis 17. Abram's reaction to God in Genesis 15, when God comes to him and speaks to him, Abram actually kind of accuses and blames God, and he says, "You have given me no children." But here, when God speaks to Abram, Abram actually fell face down in humility, trusting God at his word. I believe that it demonstrates that transforming faith that we keep talking about, that Abram wasn't the same man that he was when God first gave him the promise. God kept giving him a little bit more, and that's where I think the missed idea is gaining a little bit more information. See, God kept adding, not to reveal some mystery, but to assure Abram, to help him be able to grow his faith and be transformed in his heart. God first came and gave a promise. He just said, "Abram, you're going to have a nation. There's going to be kings and nations come from you, and all people are going to be blessed by you." And then he adds more. It's going to be like the stars of the heavens and the sand on the seashore. And then God comes to him a little bit later and he repeats that promise, but now he adds a covenant ceremony when God walked between the sacrificed animals as a sign. This is a promise, this is a covenant that I'm making to you. And so he adds proof to that promise, a little bit more of that reassurance to Abraham. And now he actually comes to Abram and he says this, "I am God Almighty." You see, I think Abram kept learning and kept growing from that reassurance to the fact that what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 4 is true, that there's been a transformation that is happening. So Romans 4 verse 18, it says, "Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed and so became the father of many nations." The father of many nations. Just as it was said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God. If we go back to Genesis 17 and get into that scene with those words in mind, we realize that how important it is that this reassurance happened, because it did help Abram transform his faith and trust in God. And when Abram falls, God speaks a little bit more, giving even more proof of his power and that he will complete this plan. And there's no question, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no way that it's not going to happen. We have a saying that the proof is in the pudding. And basically we say we don't know if it's really going to happen until we test the food that was made. Is it good? Is it tasty? You know, all the work that goes into it means nothing until you come to the end and you eat and say, "Wow, that is absolutely delicious." So the proof comes at the end. Here, God keeps giving more and more proof to Abram. And actually, here in this text, I think it's amazing. God's proof is not in the pudding, but in a name change. A name change. The proof is in your name, Abram. It says this in verse 4. It says, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you." So actually, God renamed Abram to Abraham as personal proof that this nation that he promised would come from him and from Sarah. Abram actually means exalted father. Exalted father. That's a name any dad's going to have. It's kind of that idea when you're on the playground as a kid and you're playing, you're somehow talking about dads, and you're basically saying, my dad can do anything your dad can do, and even better. We hold up our moms and our dads. We exalt them as kids that, they are awesome. They're basically all powerful too. They can do anything your dad can do, plus even more. Every dad kind of carries that idea, that name, but this name is different. You see, Abraham means father of many nations. It applies to a man whose faithfulness actually changed history. It points to the truth that's good for us to remember today. And this is one to write down if you haven't been writing things down. It's this: God delights in using ordinary people to do extraordinary things. God delights in using ordinary people like you and me, to do extraordinary things. And Abraham was a simple and right now a much humbler man. A man that God empowered to build nation through, a nation that was meant to be focused on God Almighty. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. You may feel like I'm just this average, maybe below average, you think, ordinary, normal, maybe even a boring follower of Jesus Christ. And I'm saying, when we're at that point, that's where God's going to use us. It's the ones who get into trouble, who think more highly of themselves, who think, you know what, God, aren't you lucky to have me as a part of your family so that I can do this for you? That is a person who's going to get into trouble. But God uses ordinary people, normal people like you, like me, just people who are average, and he does extraordinary things when we put ourselves in his hands. While we're talking about name changes, we need to talk about Sarai. Her name was changed too. She became known as Sarah. Sarai means my princess. But the name change to Sarah simply means princess. It drops the my out. It moves her from being a personal princess to a national princess. It changes the whole focus from just about her role with Abram to the nation of Israel. I don't think that because God only talked to Abraham that Sarah didn't play a vital role in providing the promised child, even more than just giving birth. Genesis 17:16, it says, I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. Abraham fell face down. And he laughed and he said, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. And then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. You see, God gave the same promise to Sarah. Nations and kings will come from her. Ishmael will be blessed with multitudes, but he wasn't the promised son, even though Abraham struggled in the human perspective, thinking, wow, Sarah and I are way too old to have kids. How are we going to do this? God pointed out that it was Sarah who's the important mother, not Hagar. She is the princess of God's nation. She is the princess of God's plan. And there's no other way to have this promise fulfilled other than through Sarah. We can't minimize the place of Sarah in God's great plan. Yes, like her husband and like all of us, she had her faults. But like her husband, she also trusted God and that he would accomplish his purpose, even though in her mind and in Abraham's mind, it wasn't possible. See, we can't downplay the role of Sarah. He actually is lifting her up over all the other women that would bear Abraham's children. So actually, God continues to restate his promise to Abraham many times, but he keeps adding reassurance. Trust me, Abraham, for this reason. Trust me, Abraham, keep your faith growing. Trust me more each time. I will keep showing you along the way because he is God Almighty. He will faithfully fulfill his promise, and Abraham is called to walk before God, and the first and really only proof that God requested was circumcision. That was the outward mark that the nation of Israel was set apart. And now actually we see the depth of Abraham's transforming faith, because as soon as God said it, it says that very day he, Ishmael, all the male people in his family, even those who were bought, were immediately put under a knife. Immediately. It was an action of obedience and faith. There's no mystery to reveal, because the moment God gave this promise, it was as good as done. It was as good as fulfilled. It was Abraham that needed help to trust the promise. And we need to remember, how do we walk? What's God's ultimate call? To live justly, mercifully, and humbly. You see, that call is for us today too. It wasn't just for back then. It's for us. Our world needs us to walk before God, demonstrating the way of Jesus. This is what Jesus did with his life. We need to do the same thing, a way that is different than is in our world, a way of hope that comes across even when it seems impossible and we think God is silent. The call to walk justly, mercifully, and humbly. To honor all people equally, even above ourselves, Philippians says. You see, God gave Abram and Sarah a new name, a name of promise and a name of hope. And that name represented so much of how God would work in their lives and how he was going to use them. Names by which they would live godly lives in front of the whole nation of Israel. A name of hope and promise. So my wonderment today, as we draw this to a conclusion, is what would God name me? What would God name you? He's at work. As you faithfully trust him, how would God rename you? Let's think about that as we carry on in our worship.